March 4th, 1944. 28,000 feet above Berlin, the sky shimmered like glass over a city burning in miniature. Captain Don Gentile squinted against the glare as his P-51 Mustang trembled in thin air, the needle on his fuel gauge sagging toward the red. Every pilot in his formation was watching their gauges with the same quiet dread. They'd made it to Berlin, the deepest penetration any American fighter group had ever attempted. But by every manual, every engineering calculation, they didn't have enough fuel to make it home. Gentile could feel the contradiction of the moment in his bones. They were alive in air they weren't supposed to reach, inside history they weren't supposed to make. He'd flown long enough to know how an aircraft feels when it's close to empty. The vibration changes, the throttle seems to hesitate, the engine's tone drops to a lower growl. But this wasn't supposed to be happening here, over the blackened heart of the Reich. For months, intelligence officers had said Berlin was beyond reach. Yet below them lay the sprawl of the German capital, flak bursts blooming in violent black petals, and above them hung the unbroken blue void that had carried them farther than any American fighter had gone before. He thought about how this mission had started. The briefings, the warnings, the math that said they'd never come back. Then he thought about one man he'd never met, a mechanic somewhere in England who had refused to believe in the word impossible. 6 months earlier, it really had been impossible. American bombers flying deep into Germany were being slaughtered. Without fighter escort, B-17 and B-24s fell like burning confetti, and the 8th Air Force's dream of daylight precision bombing was dying one formation at a time. Some missions lost over a fifth of their aircraft. Entire crews disappeared into smoke and cloud. Gentile had seen them from his own cockpit, tiny black specks tumbling through contrails, parachutes that never opened. The fighters that could protect them, the P-47 Thunderbolts and early P-51s, simply couldn't go the distance. Their internal fuel tanks couldn't carry enough fuel to reach the heart of Germany and return. The absurd thing was that everyone knew the problem. Engineers at Wright Field in Ohio had been running numbers for months. Commanders at High Wycombe had written desperate cables to Washington. Without long-range fighter escort, strategic bombing cannot continue. But nobody had an answer that worked. You couldn't double the size of a fuel tank without breaking the airplane's balance. You couldn't make the engine sip fuel any slower than it already did. The best aeronautical minds in America had declared the problem unsolvable. And then, in a drafty hangar somewhere in England, a motor pool mechanic had asked a question that sounded insane. What if we just strap more fuel tanks to the outside? To trained engineers, that sounded like madness. External tanks were supposed to ruin aerodynamics, weaken structure, make the plane slower, more vulnerable, a flying target. The idea had been rejected in reports and meetings months before. But that nameless sergeant, Benjamin Kelsey, didn't attend those meetings. He had grease on his hands, not rank on his collar, and he couldn't stop thinking about bomber crews dying because fighters ran out of gas. Gentile didn't know it yet, but his life that morning over Berlin was being measured in gallons of fuel that existed only because Kelsey had stayed late one night in November 1943. The story had already begun in England's damp airfields, where oil-stained ground crews patched up fighters for the next day's missions. At Bodney Airfield, a young technical sergeant stared at a Mustang's sleek wing and muttered to himself. Kelsey wasn't an engineer. He was a mechanic. His job was simple: keep the planes flying, but he kept asking why these machines had to stop short of where they were needed most. Every time bombers went out without escort, fewer came back. When he asked his commanding officers about it, they gave him the same tired answer. It's an engineering problem. The experts are working on it. Do your job, Sergeant. He did his job, and then after dark, he did something else. He dragged an old fuel tank from a wrecked P-47 out of the scrap pile, a dented 75-gallon auxiliary tank that had been designed to fit inside the fuselage, not outside. He bolted it beneath a Mustang's wing using scavenged brackets and a crude mechanical release system he'd fashioned from spare parts. It was ugly, improvised, and dangerous. But it was the kind of idea that only exists when desperation meets imagination. The next morning, Major James Howard found him tightening bolts beneath the wing. "What the hell is that?" he asked. Kelsey wiped his hands and said, "If we hang this under the wing, the pilot gets another 75 gallons. Maybe an extra hour and a half of flight time, enough to go deeper into Germany." Howard stared at him, half angry, half curious. "That's the craziest thing I've ever heard. You can't just bolt a fuel tank to a fighter. You'll rip the wing off. Have you considered what happens if it leaks? Or if it explodes?" Kelsey shrugged. "Not yet." Howard should have ordered him to stop. Instead, he nodded slowly and said, "Let's test it." That decision, quiet, unofficial, completely against regulations, was the pivot point of the air war. On November 28, 1943, under a sky the color of steel, Captain Jack Ilfrey volunteered, or maybe was volunteered, to test the contraption. The ground crew filled the tank with high-octane fuel, the smell sharp enough to sting eyes. The thing looked ridiculous, a metal blister bolted to a machine built for speed. Ilfrey climbed into the cockpit, started the Merlin engine, and rolled onto the runway. The P-51 thundered down the strip, lifted cleanly, and rose into the pale winter air. From the ground, everyone held their breath. The tank stayed attached. At 10,000 feet, Ilfrey began testing. Gentle turns, rolls, a dive. The plane handled differently, but not dangerously. He switched to the external tank, watched the fuel gauge drop, listened for the engine stutter. It didn't come. When he pulled the release handle, the tank fell away and tumbled toward the English countryside. Ilfrey's report when he landed was 4 words long. "It works." No issues. Howard didn't need more. "Build more tanks," he told Kelsey. "We're going to need them." But the higher-ups weren't amused. Word of unauthorized modifications reached 8th Air Force Headquarters at High Wycombe. Major Howard was summoned, the message from General Ira Eaker's staff blunt. "Cease testing immediately. External fuel tanks previously evaluated and rejected. Unapproved modifications to combat aircraft are strictly forbidden." Howard stood in that headquarters office surrounded by men with more rank than imagination and argued anyway. "With respect, sir, this works. Every day we don't use it, more bomber crews die." The engineers from right field rolled their eyes. "External tanks create excessive drag. They compromise structure. They're impractical." Howard laid Ilfrey's test report on the table. 75 gallons adds 90 minutes of range, enough to escort bombers another 150 miles into Germany. General Eaker leaned back, thoughtful. "What about larger tanks?" Howard didn't hesitate. "Double them, one under each wing, 150 gallons each." That's enough to reach Berlin. Silence filled the room. Berlin, the one target no fighter could reach. Eaker made his choice. Overrule right field. Authorize immediate production. Get them into combat within 30 days. Back at North American Aviation in California, engineers who had once dismissed the concept were now working 3 shifts to refine it. They took Kelsey's crude creation and reshaped it into something aerodynamic, manufacturable, standard. The teardrop-shaped aluminum tanks came in 3 sizes, 75, 108, and 150 gallon. And by January 1944, hundreds were rolling off the line each week. Kelsey never saw the assembly line. He stayed in his drafty hangar, tightening bolts, replacing spark plugs, watching his invention spread across England one fighter squadron at a time. Nobody called him a genius. Nobody saluted him. But the pilots who took off with those tanks under their wings began to understand. January 21st, 1944. Debden Airfield. 48 P-51 Mustangs stood in formation, each with 2 108-gallon external tanks glinting like mirrors beneath their wings. The target was Frankfurt, farther than any American fighter had ever gone. The pilots were uneasy. One of them, Captain Dwayne Bond, said what everyone was thinking. "We're going into combat with bombs full of gasoline strapped to our wings." The briefing officer didn't sugarcoat it. "They're self-sealing. If they're hit, they'll leak, not explode. And you can jettison them any time. Gentlemen, this is your escort range now. Frankfurt and back. Godspeed." At 0830 hours, the squadron roared into the pale winter sky. As they crossed the channel, Bond kept glancing at the tanks, those ugly, miraculous barrels of survival. The Mustang felt heavier, slower, but stable. Over Belgium, they met the bomber stream, hundreds of B-17s droning east toward their target. Normally, this was the point where fighters turned back. Not today. The Mustangs kept going. Over Frankfurt, German fighter controllers scrambled frantically. They hadn't expected escorts this deep. When the P-51s dropped their tanks and dove into combat, the Luftwaffe pilots were blindsided. 11 German fighters went down that day. Not one American escort was lost. When Bond landed back at Debden, he was grinning through exhaustion. "The tanks performed flawlessly," he wrote. "This changes everything." He was right. It changed everything. Within weeks, the 8th Air Force's entire strategy shifted. General James Doolittle, newly in command, understood the opportunity instantly. He ordered every fighter group equipped with external tanks. The goal wasn't just to protect bombers anymore. It was to destroy the Luftwaffe itself. By February, American fighters were hunting German aircraft over their own airfields. They strafed hangars, trains, convoys, anything that moved. For the first time in the war, German pilots were the ones outnumbered, outflanked, out of options. The Germans called it Die große Woche, Big Week, 5 days of relentless attacks in late February 1944 that crippled their aircraft production. Nearly 250 German fighters were destroyed, and worse, their irreplaceable veteran pilots were dying faster than they could be replaced. One Luftwaffe ace, Johannes Steinhoff, later wrote, "We expected American fighters to turn back at the border. Instead, they followed us all the way to the target. Then they came for us. We were no longer the hunters. And that led to this moment. March 4th, 1944. 28,000 feet above Berlin, where Don Gentile's Mustang trembled in the cold, where his fuel gauge hovered over empty, and where every rule of aerodynamics and engineering had been rewritten by a sergeant with a wrench. Gentile reached down, tapped the glass, and smiled. The needle barely moved, but it was enough. He turned west, toward England, toward the sea, toward home. He didn't know if he'd make it. He only knew one thing. Because of a crazy idea that no one believed in, he had the chance to try. The sound of engines over Germany had changed. By March 1944, the deep growl of the B-17s no longer echoed alone. There was another tone now, a higher, sharper pitch cutting through the sky, the sound of P-51s escorting bombers all the way to the heart of the Reich. To German soldiers watching from the ground, it was an eerie, humbling realization. The Americans could come anywhere now. Back at Debden Airfield, Captain Don Gentile sat on the wing of his Mustang, a cigarette trembling between his fingers. His face was wind-burned, eyes rimmed red from hours at altitude. But there was a quiet satisfaction in his posture. He had just returned from the mission every pilot had whispered about for months, the first full escort to Berlin and back. Against every expectation, every calculation, every protest from engineers, they had done it. His tank had run dry 10 minutes before landing. His gauges had flickered like a dying heartbeat, yet his wheels had kissed English soil again. When the ground crew ran toward him, he just smiled and said, "Tell Kelsey it worked." No one in the hangar knew exactly who Kelsey was. Word had spread across the fighter groups that some sergeant had cobbled together a fuel tank from junk parts and changed the war. But most pilots never saw him. To them, he was a rumor, a ghost of innovation haunting the hangars. At Bodney, the real Kelsey still spent his nights under wings. The war hadn't changed for him. He was a mechanic, and mechanics didn't make speeches or attend briefings. He just knew that something he'd built in secret now hung beneath every fighter in England. When the radio blared news about the Berlin raid, he didn't celebrate. He tightened another bolt, wiped grease from his hands, and moved to the next aircraft. He remembered the night his squadron commander, Major Howard, had returned from his hearing at 8th Air Force headquarters. Howard's face had been pale, jaw set. The engineers had wanted his head for bypassing right field protocol. Howard had expected suspension. Instead, General Ira Eaker had said 6 words that changed everything. Overrule right field. Authorize immediate production. That decision unleashed a storm of energy across 2 continents. In California, North American aviation's factories buzzed with urgency. Engineers who had once dismissed the idea of external tanks now raced to refine it. The first production lines for the 75 and 108-gallon tanks were built in under a week. They used thin aluminum sheets, pressed and riveted into teardrop shapes, designed to minimize drag. Each tank had a quick-release bracket and a single fuel line that could be disconnected in seconds. At first, the factory workers laughed when they saw the blueprints. "You're telling me we're bolting bombs full of gasoline to fighter planes?" one assembler said. The foreman shrugged. "Apparently it works." By mid-January 1944, crates marked P-51 external fuel tanks began shipping to England by the hundreds. Some arrived dented, others leaking from bad welds, but Kelsey and his crew learned to fix them fast. They patched holes with aircraft dope, reinforced brackets with spare aluminum strips, and tested each one with a mechanic's superstition: tap the side twice before filling. Then came the Frankfurt mission, the first real test. 48 Mustangs carrying the tanks roared across the channel. Ground crews at Debden had watched them go, silent except for the wind. Hours later, when the formation returned, every man on the field knew something irreversible had happened. For the first time, no B-17s had been lost over Germany's industrial core. The experiment had become doctrine overnight. Within days, Doolittle's new orders spread through every airfield. All escort missions will employ external tanks. Fighter groups to modify aircraft immediately. Production priority, critical. The order lit a fire under logistics units. Cargo ships crammed with aluminum tanks crossed the Atlantic. Engineers worked through nights fitting mounting brackets to Mustangs, Thunderbolts, even Lightnings. Crews learned the new routine: attach, fuel, test, jettison. Each step became muscle memory. It added 30 minutes to pre-flight prep but tripled operational reach. German intelligence noticed the shift almost immediately. Reports from radar stations near the Ruhr described American fighter escorts penetrating deeper than previously possible. Luftwaffe High Command dismissed the first reports as exaggerations. Reichsmarschall Göring's staff argued that any external tanks would make the fighters slow and easy to shoot down. General Adolf Galland, who actually flew sorties, wasn't so sure. He told Göring, "If these reports are true, then the balance of air power has already changed." By late February 1944, Galland's fears were reality. Operation Big Week, the 8th Air Force's massive assault on German aircraft production, unfolded with surgical precision. Nearly 4,000 bombers took off over 5 days, escorted by over 3,000 fighters, almost all carrying external tanks. They hit Leipzig, Regensburg, Gotha, and Augsburg. The Luftwaffe responded with everything it had: FW-190s, Me-109s, even the first Me-262's jets. But for every German fighter that took off, an American was waiting above its own airfield. The statistics were brutal. In 1 week, German aircraft losses exceeded 250. More devastating was who died. Veteran pilots, the ones who had survived since 1940, were being killed faster than replacements could learn to fly. The Luftwaffe's average pilot training time dropped from 250 hours to barely 60. New German recruits climbed into cockpits with only basic flight instruction, facing American aces who had flown 50 missions. On the ground, factory production began collapsing. Ball-bearing plants were flattened. Oil refineries in Merseburg and Brucks were burning. The German war machine, already strained, began starving for fuel. Back in England, the impact was visible in smaller, quieter ways. Bomber crews who once wrote farewell letters before every mission started leaving them unfinished. Chaplains noticed fewer men asking for last rites. The airmen's barracks, once heavy with dread, filled with laughter again. One night in early March, a group of B-17 crewmen invited some P-51 pilots to their mess for dinner. They raised tin cups of coffee to the fighter jocks. "We used to call you short-legged bastards," one bomber pilot said, grinning. "Now we call you angels." Across the table, Gentile smiled, embarrassed. "We just followed orders." The bomber pilot shook his head. "Orders didn't bolt those tanks to your wings." That same week, German morale hit rock bottom. Luftwaffe ace Hans-Joachim Jabs wrote in his diary, "They are everywhere now. Even over our own cities, even above Berlin. Their fuel never runs out. We fight until empty tanks force us home, and still they chase us." The tactical revolution was complete. For 4 years, the Germans had dictated the rules of aerial combat. They'd fought over their own territory, choosing when and where to engage. Now the Americans decided. External tanks turned range from a weakness into dominance. At Debden, Gentile's squadron received new orders. March 4th, Berlin. It wasn't just another raid. It was the statement mission, proof that no corner of Germany was safe. The briefing room that morning was silent except for the scratch of pencils. The operations officer pointed to a map. 630 miles to target. Expected flight time, 6 hours 45 minutes. You'll burn 150 gallons in cruise, 275 during combat. Manage fuel carefully. Gentlemen, if you fight too long, you won't make it home. When Gentile stepped out onto the flight line, frost still clung to the grass. Ground crews moved between aircraft like ghosts, tightening bolts, checking hoses. Each Mustang's polished aluminum skin glowed faintly pink in the sunrise. Kelsey's invention, 2 150-gallon tanks, hung beneath every wing. Gentile ran his gloved hand across the left tank's cold surface and thought about how insane it was that something this simple could change the fate of nations. Takeoff was smooth. The Mustangs formed up over the channel, silver dots against gray sea. They met the bomber stream near Hanover, hundreds of flying fortresses crawling eastward like a steel cloud. When the first German radar plots reached Berlin, panic spread through command posts. "American escort fighters approaching with bombers," an operator shouted. "Impossible," another replied. "They cannot reach Berlin." They could. At 10:42 a.m., Gentile's squadron dropped their tanks and dove to intercept. The sky erupted. FW-190S slashed through bomber formations, tracer rounds streaking like burning threads. The Mustangs answered with disciplined bursts. Within minutes, the fight splintered into dozens of twisting duels. Gentile caught a Me-109 crossing below and fired a 3-second burst. The German aircraft disintegrated, spinning into a black column of smoke. He looked down at his fuel gauge, lower than he wanted. He'd spent 14 minutes in combat. He tapped the glass, calculating. Enough to reach the channel, maybe. He throttled back, leveled out, and called over radio, "We've escorted them in. Time to go home." The flight back was quiet. The radios crackled only with fuel checks. One by one, pilots called their remaining gallons. 22, 17, 11. By the time they reached the English coast, warning lights glowed amber on half the panels. Gentile landed with less than 15 gallons left, 5 minutes of flight time. But every aircraft made it home. Not one pilot bailed out. That night, Gentile walked past the maintenance hangar. Inside, Kelsey was sitting on an upturned crate cleaning tools. The mechanic looked up, confused to see an officer approaching. Gentile stopped in the doorway. "You're the guy, aren't you?" he said. Kelsey frowned. "Which guy?" "The one who built the tanks." Kelsey smiled faintly, embarrassed. "Guess that's me." Gentile nodded, took a long breath, and said quietly, "We made it to Berlin." For the first time, the mechanic looked genuinely surprised. He stood slowly, grease-stained hands frozen in midair. "You made it back?" "Every one of us." Kelsey didn't say anything. He just nodded, looked down, and exhaled a long, shaky breath. When Gentile turned to leave, the mechanic called after him. "Captain, those tanks weren't meant to be pretty." Gentile looked back. "They don't have to be," he said. "They just have to work." And they had. The next morning, the 8th Air Force's Operations Board listed new target zones: Berlin, Hamburg, Kiel, Dresden. The war's geography had changed overnight. For Germany, the psychological blow was immense. Hermann Göring, once so confident that distance protected his cities, exploded in rage when shown reconnaissance photos of P-51s over Berlin. "If American fighters can reach the capital, then we have lost the war," he shouted. His aides didn't correct him. They didn't need to. Everyone in that room knew he was right. The external fuel tank, a crude aluminum drum imagined by a motor pool mechanic, had transformed the impossible into the inevitable. By April 1944, the sound of war over Europe had changed forever. The deep thunder of bomber formations was now accompanied by an unbroken halo of fighter engines. From the ground, civilians who once looked up to see unescorted bombers drifting toward ruin now saw the silhouettes of sleek P-51 Mustangs flying beside them like guardians. They came in waves, glinting in sunlight, wings gleaming with silver tanks that hung beneath them like twin hearts. Every one of those tanks was a quiet defiance of what had once been impossible. The Luftwaffe had no answer. For years, Germany's defensive strategy had relied on geography. They believed the channel, the fuel limits of enemy fighters, and the distance to their heartland were shields no technology could breach. But the external tanks had shattered that logic. Now, bombers weren't just reaching Berlin. They were reaching beyond it, to the oil fields, the rail hubs, the submarine pens, the very machinery that kept Germany's war running. The Reich's Air Force, once the terror of Europe, was being strangled in its own skies. Inside Luftwaffe headquarters in Berlin, the mood had turned from arrogance to quiet disbelief. General Adolf Galland sat at a conference table littered with reports from the front. He'd been warning his superiors for weeks, but Göring had refused to listen. The latest dispatch confirmed what Galland had feared. The Americans could now escort bombers to any target in Germany. Fighter coverage extended even beyond the Oder River. Galland pushed the paper away and said coldly, "We are finished." Göring's temper exploded. He paced the room, slamming his fist into the map wall. "These external tanks, they cannot be perfect. They must slow the planes, make them vulnerable." Galland shook his head. "They drop them before combat. Once they're gone, the fighters perform as if they were never there." Göring stared at him, silent, the truth sinking in. The Luftwaffe's last advantage, range, was gone. Outside, Berliners could hear the difference. Air raids no longer came in short bursts. The sirens stayed on for hours. The Americans didn't just bomb and leave, they lingered. Fighters strafed trains, trucks, and even parked aircraft. The precision and relentlessness of it felt inhuman. One German officer watching from the ground said later, "It was like the sky had turned against us." Across the Channel, at Debden and Bodny, the transformation of American air power was visible in every detail. Ground crews no longer treated the external tanks like fragile experiments. They were routine now, part of the machine. The smell of high-octane fuel filled the airfields at dawn. Mechanics moved like dancers through pre-flight rituals, checking valves, tightening mounts, running hands over cold aluminum. Kelsey watched them all with quiet pride and exhaustion. He had created something that had become invisible through its own success. He didn't seek recognition. When a reporter from Stars and Stripes visited his base and asked for an interview, he refused. "It's just plumbing and metal," he said. "The pilots are the ones who matter." But among the men who flew, his name carried a kind of reverence. Gentile mentioned him often, usually in passing, sometimes with awe. "A sergeant built these tanks out of scrap," he told a group of new pilots one evening. "And now we can reach anywhere in Europe. That's the difference between dying and coming home." By April, the factories back home were working 24 hours a day. North American Aviation in Inglewood, Republic in Farmingdale, Lockheed in Burbank, all were producing tanks in staggering numbers. Aluminum was running short, so engineers experimented with alternatives. The most revolutionary design came from the British: a disposable paper fuel tank made of compressed layers of cardboard and resin. It was lightweight, cheap, and could be burned after a single use. The first batch cost only $18 each. At a production meeting in Washington, an officer did the math. Each tank saves a fighter that costs $50,000. If it's used once and thrown away, it's still the best bargain in this war. Within weeks, paper tanks became standard. Thousands of them were shipped across the Atlantic, stacked like barrels in Liberty ships. Pilots nicknamed them Kelsey cans. They were ugly, soaked up moisture, and sometimes leaked, but they worked. And in war, that was all that mattered. The change rippled through every part of the campaign. Bomber losses, once catastrophic, plummeted. Missions that had claimed entire squadrons now returned with only minor damage. Where once chaplains had read 20 names every morning, they now read 3. The arithmetic of death had shifted, quietly, decisively. For the men in the air, the difference was felt in something smaller than statistics: confidence. In January, pilots had flown with fear behind every glance at the fuel gauge. By April, that fear had turned into calm focus. They flew farther, fought longer, pushed deeper. Gentile himself became the embodiment of that new confidence. By spring 1944, he was an ace many times over. He and his wingman, Captain John Godfrey, had turned the P-51 into a legend. Newsreels showed them returning from missions, grinning and exhausted, Mustangs streaked with soot. Gentile's aircraft, nicknamed Shangri-La, bore 12 kill marks under the canopy. On its wings, faint streaks of fuel residue from the external tanks still shimmered like badges of honor. One afternoon, after landing from a raid over Leipzig, Gentile walked across the tarmac and found Kelsey tightening a bracket under another Mustang. The mechanic looked up, blinking against the sun. Gentile crouched beside him and said, "You know, the brass is giving medals to engineers in Ohio for this." Kelsey grinned, wiping his hands on a rag. "Good for them. Somebody should get one." Gentile laughed. "You're not bitter?" The mechanic shook his head. "Nah, I didn't build it for medals. I just didn't like watching planes come back with empty seats." There was something simple in the way he said it, something that didn't need ceremony. Gentile understood. In the quiet hangar light, both men looked at the tank, at the bolts and pipes and welds, at the dull metal that had rewritten strategy. That night, across England, hundreds of other mechanics were repeating Kelsey's work, fitting, checking, filling, and releasing tanks. In mess halls, airmen joked about them, cursed them, trusted them. They were no longer an invention. They were a fact of life. Meanwhile, in Germany, life was unraveling. Allied bombing crippled fuel production. Luftwaffe squadrons often launched with barely enough gas for a single intercept. Training schools ran on fumes. Some German pilots flew to combat and didn't have enough fuel to return to base. They crash-landed in fields or bailed out over their own cities. One young flyer wrote in his logbook, "We take off knowing we will glide home." The Americans never seemed to run out. The disparity broke morale. Veteran aces began dying faster than replacements could learn their names. Major Egon Mayer, the architect of the head-on bomber attack, was shot down by P-47s in March 1944. Hans Philipp, credited with over 200 victories, was killed by Mustangs in October. Their deaths sent shockwaves through the Luftwaffe. The men who had once been symbols of invincibility were falling from the sky, their aircraft trailing black smoke across the same fields they had once dominated. Inside American intelligence offices, analysts began tracking the collapse. Charts pinned to walls showed the Luftwaffe's shrinking numbers: 2,600 operational fighters in January, 1,900 by April, fewer than 1,300 by June. Each month, the line dipped lower, the handwriting beneath it steady and unemotional. Attrition unsustainable. But behind those numbers were lives saved. Bomber gunners who no longer fired until their barrels glowed red. Pilots who made it home and wrote letters to wives who had already mourned them. The external tanks didn't just extend range, they extended life. On May 8, 1944, General Karl Spaatz sent a memo to Doolittle. Fighter escort losses down 70% since introduction of auxiliary tanks. Recommend permanent integration into all aircraft design. The words, permanent integration, were the quiet birth of a new age. The external tank had begun as a desperate improvisation, but now it was shaping the future of aviation. Engineers started sketching concepts for detachable drop tanks on jets. Others proposed refueling in mid-air, a direct descendant of Kelsey's idea. Back in the Bodney motor pool, Kelsey received a promotion to Master Sergeant. When the announcement came, his friends teased him, saying he should demand a medal shaped like a fuel tank. He laughed and said, "Nah, I'd just spill coffee on it." In the summer of 1944, he was offered transfer to a stateside engineering role, but he refused. "They need mechanics here," he said simply. "Planes don't fix themselves." By then, the war was already tipping toward its end. Normandy was weeks away. The skies over France belonged entirely to the Allies. On June 6th, when the first paratroopers jumped and the beaches lit with fire, thousands of P-51s flew overhead, each carrying the same kind of external tank that had once been considered a joke. They flew cover for the invasion, strafed German columns, circled the beaches like watchful hawks. The invasion succeeded not just because of courage on the ground, but because the air above it was American, and stayed that way. Somewhere in the chaos of that day, Kelsey was in his hangar, turning a wrench. He could hear the distant rumble of engines leaving for France. He looked up, wiped sweat from his forehead, and for a brief second smiled. He never saw the war's end from a general's map room or a pilot's cockpit. He saw it from the ground, in the endless rhythm of work. The clang of metal, the smell of fuel, the satisfaction of making something that kept men alive. By the fall of 1944, the Luftwaffe's last reserves were gone. Germany's skies were a graveyard of black smoke and broken wings. What had begun as a single man's crude experiment had become the defining edge of Allied supremacy. And still, no one outside the airfields knew his name. By the spring of 1945, the war in Europe was ending not with a single explosion, but with the slow suffocation of an empire that could no longer breathe. The skies that once belonged to the Luftwaffe now belonged to the endless silver waves of American bombers and their escorts. The airfields that had once launched Germany's proud fighter wings were craters and wreckage. Every morning, new contrails crossed the dawn sky, white lines drawn by aircraft that never turned back. And beneath them, men who once believed distance was protection now stood helpless, watching the end approach from above. For the pilots, the war had changed from survival to routine. Don Gentile's Mustang, Shangri-La, had become an icon. Journalists called him a hero, a symbol of American air power. But when the cameras turned away, Gentile was quiet. He had seen too many parachutes that never opened, too many aircraft burning in the sky. On May 7th, 1945, the day before Germany's surrender, he flew one last mission. The target was Prague. It wasn't supposed to be dangerous. It was a symbolic escort, a final gesture of presence. He walked out to his aircraft that morning, gloved hands trailing across the same wing tanks that had carried him through Berlin and Leipzig and back again. They were larger now, 150 gallons each, smooth and standardized. But to him, they were still the same crude solution born from a mechanic's stubborn question. What if we just strapped more fuel outside? He climbed into the cockpit, the metal cold under his boots, and sat in silence for a long moment before flipping the ignition. The Merlin engine roared to life, shaking the ground beneath the mechanics watching him taxi out. Among them, older and grayer now, was Master Sergeant Benjamin Kelsey. He stood with his sleeves rolled up, a rag stuffed in his back pocket, grease darkening the lines of his hands. He didn't wave. Mechanics rarely did. But as Gentile's Mustang lifted off, Kelsey's eyes followed it until it vanished into the clouds. The mission went smoothly. No German fighters rose to challenge them. The war was over. Even the enemy seemed relieved. When Gentile returned and set down at Debden, he sat in his cockpit for a long time before shutting off the engine. For once, there was no exhaustion, no fear, no adrenaline. Only gratitude, and the strange quiet that comes when a machine made for war finally rests. That night, he walked alone through the darkened airfield. The hangars were still, the runways empty. He found himself standing before a stack of old external tanks, dented and discarded, their paint blistered by weather. He touched one lightly, almost reverently. These tanks had carried more than fuel. They had carried hope, invention, defiance, the belief that impossible problems could be solved by men who refused to wait for permission. A week later, the war in Europe ended. In Berlin, the city that had once seemed unreachable was now a wasteland. American and British officers walked through ruins where anti-aircraft batteries once stood. The Luftwaffe's remaining aircraft, those that hadn't been destroyed on the ground, sat abandoned, engines cold, fuel lines dry. The war that had begun in arrogance ended in silence. Kelsey never went to Berlin. He stayed in England until the end, fixing what needed fixing, maintaining the planes that now sat idle. When the news of victory reached his base, the celebrations were deafening. Pilots cheered, champagne bottles cracked open, music blared through the mess halls. Kelsey sat outside the hangar, a cup of coffee cooling in his hand, watching the fireworks of tracer rounds in the distance. When someone asked why he wasn't celebrating, he smiled. The war's over. That's celebration enough. A few weeks later, his commanding officer handed him a commendation. It was typed on thin paper, formal, impersonal. For innovative thinking and technical excellence in developing external fuel tank systems for fighter aircraft, significantly contributing to Allied air superiority over Europe. The signature at the bottom was from a general he'd never met. Kelsey folded the paper neatly and tucked it into his toolbox. When reporters from home came to write stories about the inventions that won the war, they mentioned radar, the proximity fuse, the Mustang itself. Few mentioned external tanks, and none mentioned the man who built them first. Kelsey didn't care. He stayed in the service for a few more years, then quietly returned to civilian life. In 1953, Air Force magazine ran a feature about wartime innovation. A journalist tracked Kelsey down to a small garage outside Dayton, Ohio, where he worked fixing cars. The reporter asked what had inspired him to build the tanks. Kelsey's answer was simple. Bomber crews were dying because we ran out of gas. I figured if we carried more fuel, they'd live. So I tried it. The reporter smiled. But you must have known it had been rejected by the engineers. Kelsey shrugged. Nobody told me that. Guess that's why I didn't stop. The line became the story's headline. Nobody told me it was impossible. For most people, that article was a small curiosity, a forgotten footnote in the flood of post-war optimism. But for those who understood, it captured something deeper about the nature of progress. Innovation doesn't always come from universities or command centers. Sometimes it comes from a man with dirty hands and an idea that sounds insane until it works. Kelsey never patented anything, never gave a lecture, never sought fame. He fixed engines until his hands grew too old for wrenches, and even then, he could still recognize the sound of a Merlin engine before he saw it. When he died in 1987, his obituary mentioned his wartime service, but not the invention that had changed air combat forever. A few historians noticed, though. In small corners of aviation history, his name began to appear again, quietly, respectfully. At air shows, restored Mustangs still carry external tanks under their wings. Spectators look at them and marvel at the sleek design, the engineering perfection of it. Few realize they're looking at the descendant of a crude, hand-welded cylinder built in a cold hangar by a sergeant who simply refused to accept that men had to die because fuel ran out. Modern jets still use external tanks, streamlined, composite, smart. Some detach mid-flight, others feed through aerial refueling systems that extend range across oceans. Every one of them traces its lineage back to that single question. What if we just strapped more fuel to the outside? In military academies and engineering schools, Kelsey's story is sometimes told as an example of innovation under pressure. But its lesson runs deeper than technology. It's about courage. The courage to build something the world says can't be built. The courage of a leader willing to risk his career to test it. The courage of a pilot willing to fly it into combat. Gentile, for his part, lived only a few years after the war. He died in 1951 during a training flight, his Mustang crashing in a field near Andrews Air Force Base. His death barely made headlines in the peacetime news cycle. But at his funeral, an older man in a worn brown jacket stood quietly among the mourners. He didn't speak to anyone. He just placed a small, dented aluminum plate, once part of a fuel tank, at the edge of the casket, and walked away. No one asked who he was. But anyone who had been there above Berlin, or over Frankfurt, or across the black fields of Germany might have guessed. History records wars by the names of generals and presidents, but it is often changed by the hands of ordinary men. Men who work with tools instead of titles, who build solutions instead of waiting for orders. The external fuel tank didn't look heroic. It wasn't graceful. It was clumsy, noisy, crude, and it won the air war over Europe. The final tally tells the truth. Between May 1944 and May 1945, American fighters flew over 137,000 long-range missions. German aircraft production collapsed. Bomber losses dropped by more than 70%. Tens of thousands of airmen who might have died came home alive. In the end, that was Kelsey's legacy. Not a medal or a monument, but survival. Every bomber that reached its target and returned carried a silent echo of his work. Every fighter that landed safely owed part of its journey to the tanks that hung beneath its wings. And somewhere, in the quiet hum of an aircraft engine, in the vibration of metal at altitude, there remains the faint memory of a mechanic's voice asking the question that changed history. What if we just try this crazy idea? Because sometimes that's all it takes to change the world.